Kathleen asked me if I was a keynote. I agreed, and I asked her what she would like me to talk about. And she said, well, why corruption, of course. And it's interesting because I was a corruption investigator, and I'll talk about that. But I did talk to a lot of very high up politicians, both Republican and Democrat, about talking about corruption. Everybody told me, don't do it, it doesn't poll. So I'm going to talk about corruption. So in another life, I was the first female to join the Attorney General's Special Prosecutor's Office in New York City back in the 70s, when Serpico had testified about pervasive corruption with policing, and the governor at the time, Rockefeller, mandated Louis Lefkowitz. Anybody remember that name? He was the AG, the Attorney General, and so he established an office at the World Trade Center. It was a state police office, and what we did is we not only investigated them, but we also had our own prosecutors. It was an all-in-one office. We even had our own assigned judge. And our mandate was simply to clean up the criminal justice system of New York. That's all. So I want to just tell you about one case. So there was a group of first-grade detectives from the NYPD who were very innovative, and what they decided to do was wiretap drug dealers. And they wiretapped their phones, and once they heard on the phone that a deal was going down, they went to the location and they scouted it. And they waited for the meet. And as soon as everybody showed up, the drug dealers and the people who wanted the drugs with the money, what they did is they took the money and drugs and locked everybody up. And then they put flour in some bags and made that the evidence, and put that in the evidence locker at the property clerk's office. That was corruption, right? That was corruption. Today, years later, corruption is not the same thing. We've legalized a lot of it. It's become a lot more nuanced, and it's corroding our government, it's corroding our democracy. Today we see lobbyists who are able to give gobs and gobs and gobs of money to elected officials to sway their decisions. We're able to look at Citizens United, change the whole playing field of the political arena. We look at the LLC loophole in New York State that allows thousands of companies to get away with tax incentives. We look at dark money like Robert Mercer's, the billionaire who's funding Cambridge Analytica and Reclaim New York. We also look at the way in which we're gerrymandered, and the fact that in 2020 we get to redistribute our districts. But the fact that we are so gerrymandered throughout the whole country, not just here, but the fact that we're so gerrymandered at this point dictates that we very, very rarely have a great election. Elections are really, really swayed in many ways. So, the New York Times, about a year ago, put out a nice article that said, New York is #1 in corruption in the United States. We're #1. We're #1. So I just want to tell you what the problem is with talking about corruption. It doesn't hit home. You don't understand the consequences of it. But it affects us all. It takes away resources and services. Police departments, fire departments, emergency services can't get the budgets that they need unless they're favored by a politician. Otherwise, they're on their own. We have an increase of poverty, an increase of health illnesses, where hospitals are just overloaded. We have poor health, and we have poor environments, where companies are allowed to dump all sorts of stuff into our rivers and our streams and, this beautiful place that we have we call Earth. And so we don't look at the decisions that are made because money is passed and how it affects us, but it does. It also stagnates our communities, if you think about it. So for instance, I'll give you an example. We recently at Margaretville Hospital and Nursing Home, we were able to get $250,000 from our senator to put in a new roof. Now that's wonderful news. I used to be the chair of the hospital, and I'm always grateful whenever we get anything. But if you go below that roof, and you go to the pharmacy, and you watch people paying $60, $70, $80, $90 for a copay, or if you go to the emergency room next door, and you watch families shaking because not only are they worried about somebody who's in that bed, in that gurney, but they're also worried about the $2,500 deductible they're going to have to cough up. This is where corruption gets us. It's so subtle, we don't pick it up. It's so amazingly subtle. And we have all contributed to it by accepting it. I look at Article 421. Now, nobody knows about Article 421. It was a law that was established in 1971 by the state for New York City, which at the time was going bankrupt. So they gave a tax incentive for any real estate developer to come back to New York and build some buildings so that they could get back to where they were. That Article 421 still stands. Every year, developers are getting tax incentives. Every year, this year, it's costing us $1.4 billion. What could we do with that money? I just came out of a workshop on opioid addiction and mental health. Could you imagine what the prison could do if it had some money for counseling and treatment inside the prison before people got out? Could you imagine what we could do with schools that are running a deficit anyway, and teachers have to pay for their own supplies? So we are paying so that New York real estate developers don't have to. I call that corruption, I'm sorry. But that's where we're at. I look at the lobby orientation that we have, where everybody's lobbying and the money is just being thrown at people, thrown at our elected officials, so that they'll make a decision that may not be in the interest of their constituents, that very often is not in the best interest of their constituents. We have a senator here who oversees insurance for our state, and most of his money is coming from insurance companies. Now, how could somebody fairly and with principle make decisions when all that money is being thrown at them? And I don't think it's just a Republican thing. I don't think it's a personal thing. I think that we have a culture in this state that allows people to take money and get away with it, to go along to get along, to allow those little nuances to be affecting us. I was just talking about this to my husband, Frank, and he reminded me that yesterday he came home. He was delivering. We do home deliveries for our pantry. We run a pantry in Arkville, Middletown. And he came home and he was so upset. Well, it turned out that there was a woman that he ran into in his deliveries who he had not known. And her husband lost his job. She has cancer, no insurance, and she just lost her disability. And so one of the neighbors talked to Frank and said, maybe you can help her. So he talked to her, went back to the pantry, got a whole bunch of food, came back with enough food for her to feed her family. She has 3 kids. And she started crying. This is what I'm talking about. I mean, we're not talking about some esoteric study. We're talking about what happens right here in our backyards with our neighbors and our friends and our relatives. So when we talk about corruption, we look at something like the State Ethics Committee. Now does anybody know that there is a State Ethics Committee? That in itself might be a joke. Well, to make it even funnier, it did not meet for 8 years. Meanwhile, 150 politicians were arrested, indicted, and convicted. But we had no ethics committee. And just to make it crazier, they got this thing in Albany called Lulu, and I swear that is the term. The term stands for in lieu of salary. And because many elected officials felt that they needed a raise, but they didn't get a raise, what they did is they created this budget for anybody who was a chair of one of their committees would get anywhere from $9,000 to, I think it was $46,000 for chairing that committee. So here's the punchline. The Ethics Committee chair got $110,000 for not holding a meeting for 8 years. This is what we're talking about. So I don't care if people don't want to hear it, they need to. Because we need a culture change, and you cannot have a culture change with what we've got. Who was it? It was Einstein who said you cannot solve the problem with the same thinking that created it. So we need new people. We need new people in our government. It's one of the reasons I'm running. Again, this was not my bucket list, but I know from working corruption when I was a young person, and by the way, I started when I was 6. Good, you're awake. What I know is that from studying and from working and from, investigating, I know what corruption does to a neighborhood, to a family. So going back to those innovative cops, what ended up happening was not only did the drug dealers go to jail, all of their girlfriends went to jail by virtue of association. Their kids went to foster care. So we bumped up the system. More people had to take care of family members. More people had to stay in jail, which meant it cost more money for the jail. This is the stuff that we're talking about that we never even think about. So, what I would hope for is a transformation of the system. What I'd like to see is more comprehensive work on communities and towns and villages and agencies, as opposed to these little handouts that they're giving us. Oh, you got a new fire truck, how cool. Well, that money, by the way, just to let you know, is not even in the state budget. It's in a separate budget. $11 billion is in a separate budget so that assembly people and senators can give out these things. So that's what we're talking about. I want us to do something different. I want us to reach for good and not greed. I want us to put people before profits. And mostly, we need together to insist on principles over politics. If we do this, we may not have people like our friend at the community pantry crying because she needs food. We may not have teachers who have to spring for $250 worth of crayons and everything else in order to teach a class. We may have communities that are healthy. So that's my message. That's corruption. Thank you, guys.